Now we would like to move forward, and I would like to welcome Mr. Frank Yiannas, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Food Policy Response at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA. He is also the Principal Advisor to the FDA Commissioner on Food Safety Policies, including implementation of the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act. Mr. Yiannas will present our new era of modern food initiative. Mr. Yiannas, please, the floor is yours.
Great. And just get to my first slide, please. Kalimera from the United States. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I've been with the FDA a couple of short years now. Prior to that, I was in the private sector for many years working for the Disney company and then Walmart, world's largest retailer. But for the past 2 years since I've joined the FDA, my colleagues have been teasing me that we're hearing a lot from Greek stakeholders. And I say that's fine with me. It must have something to do with my last name and my Greek heritage. So I'm very delighted and pleased to be part of this session today in particular. And talk specifically about food, because Greek food producers and exporters play a very important role in the 21st century food system. And when it comes to food availability and food safety, we're all in this together. But let me just start acknowledging the obvious. Number one is we have just gone through, and we're still going through, probably the most historic crisis in over a century or a decade. And we know that this issue of food has been challenging. We know that the virus that causes COVID-19 is not transmitted by food. We all know that, and we know that food is unlikely to be a vehicle. The virus that causes this disease is spread human-to-human transmission. But nevertheless, it has placed challenges or strains on the food system, the global food system, because we know that protecting worker safety when they're at work, preventing them from getting ill, is also part of supply chain continuity. They're actually two sides of the same coin. So I just want to thank all of the listeners, wherever you are, and certainly Greek food producers, as well as U.S. food producers, for the role that you played to ensure that consumers worldwide and in both of our countries have access to safe and available food. Now, food imports, the reality is consumers today all over the world want to eat foods from various places. They want diversity in their diet. In the US, people think that we consume a lot of imported foods, but the reality is, on balance, the American consumer eats about 15% of the food from abroad. It's much higher in certain categories. For example, in seafood, about 94% of the seafood that Americans eat is imported from abroad. It's close to the high 40% when it comes to fresh fruits, and in the 30s for vegetables. But that's changing, and those targets are expected to increase over time. And the reality is consumers in every country, certainly in the US, want their foods to be safe, regardless of where they come from. I personally have an interest in Greek foods, having enjoyed Greek food all of my life, growing up as a first-generation American. And what I want to talk to you today is about the importance of food safety, because the reality is I personally have a desire that we see more Greek food and Greek cuisine imported into the United States. And notice that I drew a distinction between what I called foods that come from Greece that are truly novel or unique to Greece, and cuisines that are really the types of preparations that are so special in Greece. Let's go to the next slide, please. Let me begin with this premise, and I think you've probably heard this from other speakers, and you will continue to hear it today. There is no question about it that the world around us is changing very, very rapidly. When it comes to food, this is true as well. Some predict, I believe this, that we are in the midst of a food revolution. We're going to see more changes in food production over the next 10 years than we've seen in the past 30. We see the level of investments being made in food, and granted, the COVID pandemic and the economic downturn might slow this temporarily, but I don't think it'll last. In many countries such as ours, what we're seeing is foods being reformulated. We see new foods being realized, such as cell culture foods, gene-edited crops. We see new food production methods being realized. We see consumers and their tastes and demands changing, as I mentioned, wanting more foods from abroad. And we see the food system in general becoming more digitized. And at the FDA, what we believe is that more modern times are going to require more modern approaches to food safety. So in the remaining minutes that I have with you, what I want to share is a vision, a new blueprint that the FDA published a few months ago for the future. It's a 10-year view. I'm not going to talk about what are the specific requirements that Greek food producers and importers have to meet to export food to the United States. I think you have another speaker that will go through the details of the food safety modernization requirements. But what I want us to do is just for a few minutes, think about the future and envision that future, because that future isn't one that Greek and US food producers should try to predict. It's one that we can shape and build together, a stronger, safer, and more resilient food system. So in July of this year, the FDA published a blueprint called the New Era of Smarter Food Safety. It builds on the work that we've done through the Food Safety Modernization Act. It has 4 central tenets, if you will. One is the importance of creating a more digital, tech-enabled food system that is transparent for consumers and continues to build on consumer trust. And there will be many benefits, by the way, by doing so. Second core tenet is a concept that we're calling smarter tools and approaches for prevention. And I'll describe in a little bit more detail some of the work that we're doing behind each and every one of these tenets. The third one is new business models and retail modernization. I think you heard a little bit from the previous speaker. The reality is more and more consumers are switching and making purchases of foods online. Before the pandemic, we had estimated that about 1 out of every $5 spent on food in the United States would be spent on an online platform. That's 20% of the food share. We expected that would grow over the years, and what we've seen is the pandemic actually blew all those statistics out of the water, and what we're seeing now is some reports of upwards of 30+% of every food dollar that's spent at retail is being spent on an online platform. Consumers making decisions of what they buy by going online, partly out of measures of asking people to stay home and shelter in place. And we're also seeing, which is quite interesting, demographics that we had never predicted would actually make food purchases online, making them online. But I believe that this trend will continue long after the pandemic. It's the idea that you can create an endless shelf as opposed to having about 50,000 food SKUs or food items available at your favorite grocery store. The idea that you can get online and buy anything that you want from anywhere in the world as long as it meets that country's safety and regulatory compliance requirements. And then the fourth area of focus for our new era of smarter food safety is what we're calling food safety culture. The idea that food safety can't simply be about rules and regulations, but it is about human behavior. And if you're trying to improve food safety, what you have to do is influence people's behaviors. And what we really want to do is get better at combining principles of food science and concepts of organizational culture, along with the traditional food safety measures, but food science and food safety with concepts of organizational culture and human behavior blended together might allow us to be more successful. And the goal is to make people responsible for food safety as opposed to accountable for food safety. When you're accountable for food safety, you're going to follow the procedures and the requirements of a specific country because you want to follow it. If you don't and you get caught, you might not be able to sell those foods. The reality is we want people to be responsible because we care and want to take care of one another. But I'm limited in time, so I'm going to give you a flavor for what this new era of smarter food safety looks like with 2 examples. One under tech-enabled traceability. And the way I'm going to do this is tell you the story of what I call the life journey of a mango. Just so that you see, this is the end goal. This is what we're looking for. And we won't get there overnight, but we will over time. Mangoes in this country, in the United States, are generally eaten but produced in small and medium-sized farms in Central and South America, not in North America. And these mango seedlings, when they're planted, they take 5 to 7 years for these seedlings to mature, and you have plants that are bearing fruit. When they're bearing fruit, farm crews will go out there and pick the mangoes, take it to a packing house where they're washed, treated, and packed. They then get shipped by airland or sea to the United States. Once in the United States, in this scenario, they went to a processing facility that further washed, peeled, and sliced them, and put them in a clear clamshell, sliced fresh mangoes, and sent them to about 60 distribution centers across the United States, where they ended up in Walmart stores all over the country. Now, we wanted to know where these mangoes came from, and I did just that. I asked our team to trace it back. It took them a long time because these traceability records are kept on paper, one step up, one step back. It took them almost 7 days, 6 days, 18 hours, and 16 minutes to be exact. We started to do a proof of concept or a pilot, capturing data at each point in the supply chain on a distributed ledger technology called blockchain. And at the end of that pilot, capturing that information in very simple, user-friendly terms, we were able to scan a package of mangoes and trace it back to source in 2.2 seconds. That's food traceability at the speed of thought. Now, I believe consumers increasingly want to know where foods come from and how they're produced, and we have an interest in advancing food traceability. The reality, the vision that I just laid isn't going to happen overnight. So for the FDA, one of the things we've done is we've just proposed a new food regulation, a new food traceability rule in the US called the Proposed Food Traceability Rule that will outline how we'll begin this journey of strengthening how we track and trace foods over time. The rule is interesting because it centers around key data elements, critical tracking events. What are the harmonized data elements that are needed to better track food? We've identified a list of what we call a proposed food traceability list, what types of foods would require this type of tracking and tracing. And right now we're in the US in what we call the public comment period, where we have a proposed rule open and we're asking the public and interested stakeholders to give comments on what they like and what they don't like and what they change about the rule. Our goal is to have a final rule on better food traceability completed by the year 2022 for certain foods, not all foods. And while it won't require the type of electronic traceability that it just shared, it'll be a beginning to that journey. Another part of the new era that I thought I'd paint for you just for illustration is one on imported foods. I think I shared with you about 94% of imported foods in the United States comes from abroad, seafood in particular. And the reality is imported food is expected to increase year after year. You can see it's been doing it for 2 decades. I don't think this is going to decrease. In fact, I believe it's going to continue to increase. Shipments might get smaller as we start really maturing this e-commerce world that we're living in. But imported food trends in terms of the number of line items that are imported in the United States are expected to go up. Our goal is to work through the Food Safety Modernization Act and the foreign supplier verification aspects requiring importers to make sure those foods meet US safety requirements. At times, FDA will go out and do food safety inspections abroad. But another tool that we use is something that we call Predict, that screens every single line of imported food items into the United States using a risk ranking model that's largely subject matter expert produced and driven. So one of the things we wanted to do is, with this idea of a new era of smarter food safety, could we take these new and emerging tools, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, to strengthen our predictive capabilities of finding violative products that are imported into the United States? And so we took 2 years of seafood data that was imported into the United States. We looked at it with our current Predict system, but then we overlaid this functionality of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And our initial proof of concept showed that by doing that, this technique that could take large volumes of data and, look for trends and patterns, we could increase our predictive capabilities of finding which containers or shipments of food were violative, meaning they didn't meet US standards. We could increase our chances of doing that by 300%. By 300%, that's a game changer. We'll continue to work on these types of tools. Congress has given us $5 million to do a further pilot of this technology this year. But hopefully those 2 examples give you a flavor for what's to come. I shared that with you because while we just experienced the largest food test in over a century, I like to say that the food system in many countries around the world, certainly in the US, passed the test. We didn't pass it with flying colors. Early in the pandemic, there were some outages certain in retail stores in the United States as consumers rushed to make purchases. Certainly, we saw as restaurants and hotels and theme parks in this country had to close, some imbalances. And so we saw actually large volumes of food not being used and being discarded. It wasn't that we had a food supply issue, we had a supply chain logistics challenge in that we had too much food in the wrong places as those places closed down. And I'm convinced that doing some of the work that we're talking about here for the new era of smarter food safety over the next decade will allow us to create a more digital, transparent, and safer food system that will actually be stronger and more resilient for consumers. So that's just a few minutes to whet your appetite on the future and where we're going. We would love to build this future together, and we would love for Greek food producers and food exporters to be part of this journey with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yiannas, for your excellent presentation. And the truth is that end-to-end traceability is very important. And congratulations on this initiative. I would like to ask a question, respectful of your time, a brief one. Will the new era of smarter food safety initiative replace any of the requirements that Greek food producers have to meet under the FESMA, under the Food Safety Modernization Act?
No, it's a great question, Dina. Thank you. No, for the time being, any food producers or exporters listening in, the requirements that you should be expected are the FSMA requirements, which you've come to know now over the past 9 years. That's not going to change. We're going to build on this future together. And we think a lot of it is just trying to use new and emerging technologies to comply with the current FSMA requirements, but not necessarily changing the requirements.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. It was a great honor for us to have you here today, and wish you a nice day. Thank you for your time.